Hey everyone, church family, and those who maybe are joining us for the first time. We're happy to welcome you to Dulles today. It's not too late at all to find juice or wine or some type of bread for communion. I'm going to be leading us in just a few minutes in communion. And before we start, I want to just tell you that this summer we're going to do a deep dive into what we called a few weeks ago the most exciting idea on earth. So I hope whenever you're in town this summer, you'll devote 1 hour on Sunday mornings to join us as we consider what's going to heal this planet and what's going to put peace in our homes and our communities. I believe it to my core that Jesus laid out the roadmap for this kind of peace and this kind of life. And we're going to talk about it this summer and how we get to be a part of it. So don't miss, invest with us financially here. Join a team, serve in some way. If you don't know where to start, just ask on our app or in the lobby at Lightridge. You can email us. And we'd love to include you in what we're building here at Dulles Church. Okay, what a week. You know, our hearts have been heavy. Following our worship night, Wednesday night, where we devoted time to the horror that happened in Texas earlier this week. And I just think this is an appropriate time to think about the table that Jesus invites us to. And the first table he invited us to was hours before his own death. And as morbid and heavy as that can seem, it leads to life. That's what his death was all about. So I was thinking this week in getting ready for this about images that we've seen our whole lives of what I'm going to call the tropics. You know, like an oasis kind of scene of water, maybe waterfalls trickling down into it, and palms or palm trees, or, you know, that tropical kind of vegetation that's around water that just makes everyone feel like, wow, that's paradise. And I think the planet collectively responds that way. We spend some time, at least once a year, on I-4 in Florida. We've got so many friends in the Central Florida area, and Mackenzie used to work at Disney World. And we find ourselves in that asphalt mess of I-4 trying to get through Orlando, and then we come up on Volcano Bay that Universal built, the largest water park in the world. And even that, you know, a water park kind of man-made still kind of has that effect on me, like, wow, look at all the waterfalls and the palm trees around it. There's something about that scene of water that I think is so compelling to all of us, because the water is like a source of life, so much life. There's so much dark green, and the water just communicates that it's comfortable, it's warm, it's not cold or icy. You know, there's a lot we could say about this kind of image that looks like paradise to us. And I believe there's a link to it in how the world was made and what we were supposed to live in, how we were supposed to live before humans chose selfishly to walk away from God's control, from God being the source of life. So you may not think about this, or maybe you've never thought of this, but the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, revolves significantly around water. Water being a source of life. Now, of course, God created the water. God's ultimately the source of life. But in Genesis 1, there's this void. The earth is made, and there's a void. And then this water springs up in the void. And the water turns into streams and into a river. And we're told in Genesis 2, a river actually flows out of Eden to water the rest of the garden. It's this beautiful image of life bubbling up and life expanding to create more life and to sustain life. And then, of course, humans are created in the garden, Eden being the presence of God. We're created to extend life. We're supposed to carry this life out into the whole world, all of creation. And we messed it all up by making ourselves the source of life, or so we thought. And so we still tend to think on any given day when we try to take control or our selfishness takes over. And the irony is that when humans did this, when humans tried to be the source of life instead of God, it led us out of Eden, out of the paradise of the garden, what this world was supposed to be, into the wilderness, into the desert. And then through the story of God and all of Scripture, we have this recurring theme of water. There's Jacob's well early in the Old Testament, and this important moment where Israel is looking at the reality of God being the source of life, he actually being who we should revolve around, and how if they bought into that, if they accepted that, if they owned that, the people of God in Israel could actually become themselves sources of life for God extended into the world. And they didn't, and they chose selfishly, and they ended up literally wandering in a wilderness, in the desert. And there's a picture that Ezekiel the prophet has of a desert where humans are described as being dry bones, just bones laying on the desert floor. And then a spring comes up suddenly out of the desert, and the dry bones are made alive. Humans are made alive again, and this spring turns into a river and begins flowing into the whole world. And it's this foretelling of God bringing humans back to life, bringing us back into the Garden of Eden. And that leads us to the New Testament, to the story of Jesus. And it's interesting that the gospel writer, John, one of Jesus' very closest friends and disciples, he writes with a very intentional theme of water throughout his whole gospel, throughout the good news of John. In John 4, Jesus encounters the woman at the well, and it's interesting, this is Jacob's well. This is the same well that we read about way back in the Old Testament. And Jesus is telling this woman, this Samaritan, this outsider to the people of Israel, that he could be her source of water. She's there to collect water for her family in the heat of the day, but he actually is the ultimate source of life, source of water. And she says, give me this water. And they have this fascinating dialogue where Jesus is inviting humans again into the paradise, back in the movement toward Eden, toward paradise, life, peace, wholeness, health, with him as our source of life. We go further into John, and we come to John chapter 7. Jesus says, if anyone is thirsty, let them come to me and drink. The next verse in John 7:38, anyone who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. Jesus is talking about how we crave wholeness and peace and good and health, and we want this for our kids, and we want it for our communities. He has come into this world to be the source of life in the wilderness, in the desert. And if we drink of him, we actually become sources of life. His river of life, life-giving love and power will actually flow from us out to others. We come to John 13. This is the Last Supper scene, and Jesus gets up from this sacred meal. This is the all-important meal where he will share communion with the disciples. He'll break the bread and pass the chalice of wine. And he gets up, he interrupts that dinner to take a water basin. And again, this is all very intentional in the story of Jesus. And he begins to wash the dirt off of their feet. And of course, the argument ensues, Jesus, what are you doing? You're not our servant. Servants do this. And Jesus says, I must become your servant. That's why I came. To be your life, I must serve you. And it's interesting that Jesus talks about making them clean, entirely clean, and giving them life through the symbol of washing part of them, their feet, with water. And this is, of course, hours before Jesus would go to the cross and bleed and die for you and me to have full life. The water in the water basin that Jesus would wash their feet with was symbolic. He was giving them a picture, giving us a picture of what would happen just hours later when his blood would spill to give us life. Look what happens the next day. This is the crucifixion day. Jesus is on the cross. This is in John 19. But one of the soldiers pierced his side, and immediately blood and water came out. Isn't it interesting that John includes the water part? You know, you would think, why doesn't John just tell us he bled? He was pierced with the sword in his side, and he bled. John is continuing to cleverly connect us to connect Jesus, the living water, the source of our lives, of the source of life for humanity, back to Eden. Jesus is the life of Eden. Jesus is the water that flows into the rest of the garden and ultimately to the world. And then we go backwards in John to the very first miracle. And this is in the little town of Cana at a wedding. And now that I've kind of set the stage for John intentionally showing us example after example of water linked to Jesus, Jesus being the source of life, even at the Last Supper. John says, on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "We have no more wine." Mary tells Jesus tells the servants, "Do whatever Jesus tells you to do." Nearby stood 6 stone jars, water jars, the kind of water used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons of water. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best wine till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. The substance of his reality is what glory means. Jesus begins revealing the truth and reality that he is the source of what we're thirsting for. He is the source of life, of everything we want for our families and our relationships, everything we want for a world that would have peace and no peace. Jesus is the source. And it's just so interesting how we have the major themes of Scripture, but when we dig deeper, we see these sub-themes where water and wine become this clear, intentional theme to describe who Jesus is, tied all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Jesus, the water of life, the life of Eden, is who quenches our thirst for life, our thirst to be alive. And the best, most satisfying drink would be the best tasting wine. It's Jesus' first miracle because he's foreshadowing his last miracle at the Last Supper, where he would once again take the water for cleansing and would lead immediately to the wine at the table that would symbolize how the ultimate experience of stepping into the source of Jesus' life would be accepting his blood spilled for you and me. And so with that, I invite you to take a piece of bread, cracker, whatever you have nearby, and a cup of juice or a cup of wine. And we just cherish here for just a moment the sweet understanding that water was used in creation to show us the paradise that God had in mind for us. that we would live and thrive, never decaying, never aging, never experiencing death, whole and fully alive, from him being the source, he ultimately being the living water at the center of Eden. And he would come into our wilderness and into our desert and our brokenness and would offer himself to us. And not as a high and mighty king who would take a throne in Jerusalem or in Rome, but as the source of life who would lay down his life in place of our own selfishness. He would take on our greed, our envy, our anxieties, our fears, so that we could be made fully alive. So his invitation is for us to leave the desert behind, to leave behind the wilderness, and step back toward Eden, seeing him as the one who quenches our thirst. Jesus as our source of life. Jesus as the life of Eden. So with that, Jesus, we take this bread, this symbol of your body that was broken. And we so humbly and so gratefully, we eat together. And we take the cup of wine, the cup of juice, which symbolizes Jesus' blood spilled, his blood and water that would pour out of his body so that we could be made alive. Let's drink together. Jesus, thank you for the beauty of your story. Thank you for the intricacies of you revealing yourself as the water of life, as a living water, our source of life. You were at the center of Eden, at the center of paradise, and you've come to lead us back to that eternal paradise that we so crave. God, we're craving it this week. We choose you. We say yes to you. Thank you for loving us. Next week, if you're in the Dulles area, if you live in Northern Virginia, we're back at Lightridge just like normal. I love you, Dulles family, wherever you watch from the Midwest, from the South, from the West Coast. I'm thinking of so many of you right now who join us each week here online. Just know you're loved and you're part of God's family and you're part of our family. I'll see you next weekend.